and they can do that. Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Kennedy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Noem, with about a year as DHS Secretary under your belt, there's no shortage of criticisms for me to choose from today.
Let's dive into this full-blown indictment of how the Department of Homeland Security is being run under Secretary Kristi Noem. And Representative Kennedy of New York didn't come with sound bites. He came with receipts.
You've deported American citizens, bringing a level of inhumanity to this nation's immigration laws that I haven't seen in my lifetime. You've terrorized communities, including my own in Buffalo, New York, vowing to go after the worst of the worst, but instead detaining women, children, and hardworking individuals in pursuit of the American dream. You've botched a response to one of the most devastating floods we've seen, an extreme weather event along the Guadalupe River that took more than 130 innocent lives, including more than 35 children. Central Texas waited days for your agency to respond because of the reckless policies you've implemented. Your FEMA lead was missing in action, completely unreachable, as were FEMA's call lines, with 84% of calls unanswered on July 7th, 3 days after the floods. FEMA personnel, despite your slashing of their ranks, who were ready and willing to help, waited days to spring into action because of your policies. Disasters do not wait for bureaucracy. Your abysmal performance goes beyond your woeful disaster response. You've also taken a sledgehammer to FEMA's recovery, preparedness, and mitigation missions. You canceled more than $4 billion in building resilient infrastructure and communities funds, a program that helps communities reduce their risk of natural disasters. You withheld millions in FEMA funds for emergency alerting infrastructure found to be in violation of the Impound Control Act. You, perhaps most critical to my state of New York, canceled more than 90% of New York State's Homeland Security Program funding, including $134 million in urban area security initiative funds for New York City's greater metropolitan areas. You have mismanaged these grants to the point where cities and states, including New York, are suing you to recover counterterrorism funding that's lawfully theirs and that Congress intended for them to receive. It's a tragedy that we're here today discussing these cuts to counterterrorism and security grant funds for a city that was the main site of the September 11th attacks, the entire reason your department was established in the first place. As the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Emergency Management, it's my responsibility to show the American public how you've systemically upended FEMA and emergency preparedness as we know it. So I have a couple of questions. Simple yes or no answer will suffice. Would you agree with the national security officials' assessment that the United States has been operating in a heightened threat environment for several years now?
Yes.
Yes or no? Would you say New York City is susceptible to these kinds of security threats?
Yes, and that's why they should spend.
So with New York City being the number one terrorist target in the nation,
the federal government gave them
with New York City being the number one, I reclaim my time, with New York City being the number one security threat in this nation, it's unconscionable that you would cut $134 million in urban area security initiative funding for the city of New York. What compelled you to knowingly make our cities less safe with these funding cuts?
What compels you, your mayor, and your governor to release thousands of criminals on the streets rather than to turn them over to ICE? You'd rather release
Secretary Noem,
a murderer out onto your street,
you cut $134 million
and honor our detainers.
in funds to support the security of New York City and the state of New York, the number one threat in this nation. In your own words, your cuts are blatantly political, callous, and outright dangerous. It's clear you have no interest in countering real threats in the homeland. While high-risk cities and disaster zones wait for help, you've devoted the past 11 months of violent raids, anti-police policies, and nonstop photo ops. You've brought shame to a department that was created after 9/11 in a time of unity to protect our people. Your failure to lead is a direct threat to the homeland security in our nation, and you should resign immediately. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
This hearing wasn't supposed to be dramatic. It was supposed to be oversight. But when oversight meets a department that's failing on disaster response, immigration enforcement, and public safety all at once, things tend to boil over. From the moment Kennedy took the microphone, you could tell this wasn't going to be a polite back and forth. He laid out a picture of DHS that, frankly, should alarm anyone who believes the federal government has a basic responsibility to protect people, especially in moments of crisis. And the reason this exchange matters, the reason it shouldn't just fade into the endless archive of congressional clips, is because it exposes something deeper than a partisan fight. It exposes a fundamental disagreement about what government is for. At its core, Homeland Security is supposed to be boring. It's supposed to be quiet preparation, careful planning, and systems that work so well you barely notice them, until the day you desperately need them. It's emergency alerts that go out on time. It's FEMA teams already mobilized before the floodwaters peak. It's cities having the resources to prevent attacks instead of reacting to them after the fact. What Representative Kennedy laid out is a version of DHS that has drifted far away from that mission. Instead of prevention, we see reaction. Instead of coordination, confusion. Instead of leadership, deflection. And the most troubling part is that the costs of these failures are not theoretical. They're measured in lives lost, communities destabilized, and trust eroded. When FEMA doesn't answer calls during a flood, that's not a bureaucratic hiccup. That's a mother wondering if help is coming. That's a family trapped on a roof. That's first responders stretched beyond capacity because the federal backstop failed. When disaster mitigation funding is cut, the damage doesn't show up immediately. It shows up months or years later, when a storm hits harder than it should have, when infrastructure fails that could have been reinforced, when a community is wiped out instead of protected. And when counterterrorism funding is slashed for cities that are known targets, that's not fiscal responsibility, that's gambling with public safety. What makes this moment especially unsettling is how easily those realities were brushed aside in favor of political talking points. Instead of grappling with the substance of the criticism, we saw a pivot to blame, to fear-based rhetoric, to arguments that might work on cable news but don't solve operational failures. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You can believe in border enforcement and believe FEMA should function. You can care about immigration law and believe disaster response should be fast, competent, and humane. These things are not mutually exclusive, unless ideology demands that they be. The Department of Homeland Security was born out of national trauma. It was created in the aftermath of September 11th, during a rare moment of unity, when the country agreed that prevention, coordination, and preparedness mattered more than politics. That's why it's so jarring to hear funding for New York City, the very symbol of that trauma, treated as expendable. That's why it's so alarming to hear disaster readiness described as optional. And that's why calls for accountability in moments like this aren't radical, they're necessary. Leadership isn't about how aggressively you enforce power. It's about how responsibly you wield it. It's about whether the systems under your control work when people are at their most vulnerable. This exchange forces a simple but unavoidable question. If the federal government can't protect people during disasters, can't prepare cities for known threats, and can't administer immigration law without harming citizens, then what exactly is it doing? Because Homeland Security without security is just branding. Preparedness without preparation is just rhetoric, and toughness without competence is not strength, it's risk. This wasn't just a congressman venting frustration. It was a warning that if governance becomes about optics instead of outcomes, the consequences won't be partisan, they'll be human. And that's something every single one of us should be paying attention to. If you made it this far, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think DHS is focused on the right priorities right now? And as always, like, subscribe, and share, because accountability doesn't happen in silence.